The movie begins with a man sitting in his apartment and watching television. President Nixon is on giving a speech at a press conference. Then it switches to other officials speaking about how the Soviets are trying to attack the USA. The name Dr. Manhattan gets mentioned. While the man watches this in his apartment, a burglar kicks his door open and comes into his room. They start fighting, and after a while, it seems like the burglar is winning. Tables get broken in the fight, and eventually, the man tells the burglar that it's all a joke. Following that statement, the burglar throws him out of the window and the man falls a great distance onto the concrete. Blood surrounds him, and he is most likely dead. During the opening credits, we see a group of superhero individuals called the Watchmen. Various happenings and deaths are shown, and the credits conclude with an individual throwing a Molotov cocktail into a television store, which then blows up in flames. We then see the police in the apartment of the man who died. They look at pictures of him shaking hands with the president and state how he was someone big. Then the scene switches to showing a man with a covered head. He wears a trench coat and a fedora. He is Rorschach. While we see him ascend to the roof of a building using a grappling device, his voiceover plays where he expresses briefly his political motives. He then gets inside a room and uncovers a secret area while there. Two policemen then say they heard something and come in to investigate. Rorschach incapacitates one of them. The other one sees him standing near the window. He points his gun at him, and when he shoots, we see that Rorschach is already gone. The next scene has two males speaking about the Watchmen. They both see there on the TV what Rorschach was reported to do. One of the males, Daniel, then leaves and starts going home. When he arrives at his building, he sees the door near the doorknob being busted. He walks in and sees through the open door to his room that Rorschach is sitting there. He tells him that he is eating his beans. They then walk into another area where Rorschach tells Daniel that the comedian is dead. They speak about it and speculate about why such an act was done. At the end of their conversation, Daniel asks him what happened to the good old times, to which Rorschach replies that Daniel quit. We then see Rorschach walk the street at night with his voiceover playing again. He says how there is a war coming and that evil must be punished. The scene changes to Daniel observing a male giving an interview with the press. When it is over, the man comes to him, and Daniel greets him as Adrian. They both speak of Rorschach, and Adrian says that he is a sociopath. Then Daniel says that the world knows Adrian the most out of them, which is why he is warning him first of what is to come. In the next scene, we see Rorschach break into a building. He walks its hallways until he enters a room. In there we see a giant bluish-white individual working on something gigantic just as he is. He is Dr. Manhattan. A female then arrives to Rorschach, whom he addresses as Silk Spectre. While they speak, Dr. Manhattan starts shrinking. When he shrinks to regular human size, he speaks about how his vision of the future is obscured. He says how it could be the possible nuclear war of the future that is causing it. Rorschach tries speaking to Dr. Manhattan about what he believes is happening, but Dr. Manhattan does not want to hear about it, so he teleports him outside of the building. Silk Spectre then tells him how confused she is about how he is not his usual self, and Dr. Manhattan shows her visions of her life. He tells her if only she could see time how he sees it. We then see him go back to work using his powers of telekinesis. He makes dozens of small metal objects fly into their proper place as part of some great machine. The following scene has Daniel and Silk Spectre sitting in a restaurant. They converse about the days when they were heroes fighting crime. She then tells him that Dr. Manhattan tells her that a nuclear war is coming. We see Daniel being taken aback by this information, and after a while, he escorts her to her taxi. A cemetery is then shown. A car arrives on the spot with a coffin inside. The coffin then gets taken out and taken to its intended rectangular hole in the ground. We see the Watchmen there witnessing the event. Afterwards, Silk Spectre appears in a house and quickly runs to the toilet to vomit into it. She then walks into a room and meets her mother. They speak about the death of the comedian, Eddie, and after that, a scene from the distant past is shown. Silk Spectre's mother is there as a member of a group called the Minutemen. She is also known as Silk Spectre. While she is in a room undressing by herself, Eddie comes in and starts coming on to her. She rejects his invitations and he starts hitting her due to that. Then he slams her head against the pool table and gets ready to take advantage of her. But before he does that, another Minutemen member comes in and beats Eddie. The Watchmen observe the funeral take place. While they do, Dr. Manhattan stands there and remembers the past. He is a giant in a war. He walks the field while enemy soldiers run away from him. He destroys them with telekinetic powers. Then, in a bar after the war, he and Eddie are there. A small lady comes to Eddie and speaks to him about a baby while being pregnant. He tells her that he wants nothing to do with her or her country. At that point, the lady starts attacking him. In response, he shoots and puts her to eternal sleep. Then he asks Dr. Manhattan why he did not stop him. He says how he could have turned the gun and the bullets into something else, but he didn't. In the next scene, we see the Watchmen at a meeting. They talk about their attempts to save the world. Eddie is there with them, expressing mostly pessimism. After that, we see a riot on a street. A big hovering vehicle arrives with Eddie and Daniel inside it. Daniel is there as the Night Owl. They attempt to stop the riot, but the rioters give them a hard time. So Eddie jumps out from the machine and starts physically fighting with the people. He has no trouble busting several of them to the ground, and then he starts firing away with a shotgun. Daniel comes to him and says what happened to the American dream, to which Eddie replies that Daniel is looking at it. At the funeral's end, Daniel tosses the smiley pin that Eddie wore into his grave, and then they all leave the cemetery. The following scene has a man coming into his room and looking inside the refrigerator. Inside, he flips a piece of cardboard over and it says "Behind you." He turns around and Rorschach is there to seize him. He addresses him as Moloch. Moloch then tells him that Eddie appeared in his room recently, that he broke into his place. The scene then shows Eddie sitting on Moloch's bed while Moloch lies in it. Eddie cries while speaking to him, saying that he has never done anything as bad as he currently did. It is not revealed what it is. Rorschach then lets him go. Moloch asks if he is now clean, but Rorschach searches a cabinet of his and finds illegal medication. Moloch responds to that by saying he has cancer, and not the kind that one can get better from. Rorschach then walks the streets at night again. His voiceover is on as he ponders what happened to Eddie the comedian. He says how Eddie saw the nature of humans, how savage they are. He saw their nature and decided to be a parody of. The next scene has Dr. Manhattan engaged in romantic moments with Silk Spectre. She then notices that there are two of them in bed with him. This turns her off and she gets out of bed. After that, she gets even more turned off when she sees that a third Dr. Manhattan stands and works in the other room. She confronts him about his mind not being there with her due to him working, but he tries to comfort her by saying that his attention was on her the whole time. She then throws an item at him that passes through his head, and it ends up breaking the TV behind him. After that, she leaves. Dr. Manhattan at a later time is seen sitting on his bed and looking at a picture of her and him from how he was before. Meanwhile, Daniel is at home and gets someone at his door. He opens it and Silk Spectre, Lori, is there. She then comes in and tells him that she left Dr. Manhattan. She tells Daniel that it is very hard with him now. He is very different and hardly notices people anymore. We then see Dr. Manhattan dress himself in a suit with telekinesis. He then teleports into a station where he is supposed to give an interview. At the same time, Daniel and Lori walk the streets at night and enter an alley. Several gangsters see them enter and decide to follow them. In that area, there are even more gangsters, and now the duo is surrounded by them. The man conducting the interview welcomes Dr. Manhattan on stage. Daniel and Lori start fighting with the gangsters. Members from the audience ask Dr. Manhattan questions. And the scene keeps changing, and we see gangsters fly into the air and get their bones broken when either Lori or Daniel strikes them. They easily win the fight. The final scene of the interview has a questioner make a comment about Dr. Manhattan's previous girlfriend. He says how she got cancer and has a certain amount of time to live. She then enters the area and expresses anger towards Dr. Manhattan. She takes her wig off and then leaves. After that, chaos ensues in the room, with the audience getting up and approaching him for questioning. This then causes him to get angry, and he uses his powers to disappear them. Later, Dr. Manhattan stands in the desert and looks at the stars. He remembers his past. He stands at a party with his girlfriend, Janie. Both of them are physicists. His voiceover mentions when he met her. At that time, he looked like a regular person. He also mentions his friend, and then how he eventually died from cancer. We then see the event that led to the accident. Dr. Manhattan, as a regular person, walks with his girlfriend and his friend, and then tells them to go on while he goes back to get his watch. He enters a room and picks up his watch, but then he gets locked inside. They tell him that they cannot get him out, and after that we see electricity start to surround him. Shortly after, it consumes and obliterates him. Strange events then start to take place, with parts of him appearing in certain places, and then disappearing. But then, eventually, Dr. Manhattan materialized in full. The whole phenomenon becomes a big event. The leaders of the nation acknowledge him for what he very likely, a godlike entity. He then puts a symbol of a hydrogen atom into his forehead. He then stands with several officials in a desert and disassembles a tank with his telekinetic powers, and then puts the parts together into a huge metal ball. President Nixon personally asks him to help end the war in Vietnam, and 1 week later it is over because of him. Then he disappears several wrongdoers at a bar. Afterwards, he tells Janie that he still wants her and always will. But then, his voiceover admits that that was a lie. He meets Lori one day and starts kissing her. Janie gets angry with that and tells him it is because she is getting old. The voiceover of Dr. Manhattan says that he is tired of Earth and people. He is tired of the tangle of their lives. He then sits in a desert and unearths and creates a giant clock from the sand. Lori is then seen sitting in a room while government officials question. They ask for the whereabouts of Dr. Manhattan. She does not know. But then two scientists run in and say that he is on Mars. We then see a conference room. President Nixon is there with many other officials. One of them tells him that the Soviets placed their tanks short of the Afghan border. They speak of the war to come and Nixon moves the state of national alertness to DEFCON 2. Back with Lori, she asks to go use the restroom. While she and an official walk there, she knocks him down and handcuffs him to the sink in the restroom. Then she tells him that the only person who can bring in Dr. Manhattan is he himself. In a later scene, we see Adrian speaking to several individuals. He tells them that the only person he could ever relate to was Alexander the Great. He tells them that the world will survive. Then the elevator opens, and a man with a gun starts shooting at all of them. He shoots several people and blows the fingers off of a female, but Adrian quickly brings him down. He demands the assassin to tell him who sent him. But once he does, the assassin starts foaming in the mouth and dies. The scene changes to Daniel and Lori sitting at a restaurant. They speak about who wants to put them to eternal sleep, and Daniel asks her if she would like to stay with him. She hesitates, but he insists that she should. While they walk the street during the daytime, Rorschach observes them without his mask. This disallows them to recognize him. Afterwards, Rorschach visits Moloch again by breaking into his place. He sees him sitting there, and he speaks about the assassination attempt on Adrian. But then he finds that Moloch is dead. There is blood on his forehead. After this discovery, the police start announcing on their speaker from outside for Rorschach to come out of the building. They send in armored forces. When they get near the door, Rorschach opens it and starts torching them. They fire at him, but he escapes. Then he has to deal with more police outside. He fights them, but there are too many, and so they grab him and remove his mask. We then see Rorschach in prison. He sits in a confession room with possibly a doctor. The man shows him some pictures and asks him what he sees in them. Each picture triggers a memory from his distant past. Then Rorschach tells him that he does not like him. He says that, unlike the doctor, he does not pretend that evil does not exist. He then starts telling him a story about a kidnap case in the past. It was a time when he was too soft on criminals. Rorschach searches for a little girl in some apartment. Then he finds her leftovers. Afterwards, the killer arrives and Rorschach throws his dead dog through the window at him. He then handcuffs him to a chair, and the man yells in confusion as to who Rorschach is. Rorschach confronts him about the dead girl, but the man denies that he did it. He then shows him his dead dog, and the guy confesses that he did, and asks to be arrested. But Rorschach sees justice differently and puts him to eternal sleep instead with a big knife to his head. Even after killing him with the first strike, he continues to bring the knife down on him several times and his head. He then tells the doctor that he as a regular person died that night with the little girl. After that, he was only Rorschach. The doctor leaves and says to the guard at the door that he can't help him. Then at the cafeteria in prison, a big guy tries to cut Rorschach with a knife, but Rorschach catches it and beats him to the floor. Then he rips out a container full of hot oil and pours it on the prisoner. The police take hold of him after that, and while they hold him, he tells all the prisoners that they are locked in there with him instead of the other way around. In the next scene, Lori walks around Daniel's hidden area. She pulls off a covering and reveals the big airship Daniel and Eddie were in earlier. She gets inside and presses some of the buttons, and then she presses a button that shoots out some fire. With that, she causes a fire in the room that she then tries to put out. Daniel comes in to help her and the fire gets extinguished. They then speak about a few matters, and then she puts on his night vision superhero goggles. It shows her point of view as being fully capable of seeing in darkness. Afterwards, they leave that room and go into Daniel's living room. Lori says to him that Dr. Manhattan sees a lot of things, but he doesn't see her, and she starts kissing him on the couch, which then escalates into intense moments. In the prison, Rorschach sits in his cell while a dwarf and his two big companions approach him. The dwarf tells him how he has been in that prison for 15 years because of him, and so have many others for a different amount of time. He then threatens Rorschach with what is to come for him there. Then there is a dream scene. Daniel and Lori stand together without clothes in a desert. Then their nakedness gets peeled off, and they stand in their superhero outfit. They start kissing. Following that, a nuclear bomb explodes in the distance, and eventually, the destructive heat wave reaches and disintegrates them both. This causes Daniel to wake up. He stands without clothes in the other room, looking at his night owl suit. Lori comes to him, and he tells her that he's tired of being afraid. She agrees with him, and shortly after that, we see him get his act together and stand with his suit on. Lori then joins him in her outfit. They get in his airship and fly into the city. Once flying high above, they spot a burning building with people inside. With the airship's firepower, they shoot a large water container that stands on the roof, and it falls with its water coming out and extinguishing a decent portion of the flames. Lori jumps into the building through the roof and gets to the people trapped in there. She then escorts them onto the airship. When they are alone in the cockpit, they start kissing. And then, again, they start engaging in intense moments. While in the midst of it, Lori accidentally presses the button that shoots out the long flame. People see it from the street. Back in prison, there is a riot going on. The dwarf and his friends are there to get at Rorschach. One of his colleagues puts his hands in the cell, which Rorschach then ties together. With nothing much that the dwarf can do, he orders his other companion to cut the cell open, which also required the mutilation of the other's arms. When he cuts through, he charges toward Rorschach. But Rorschach swiftly slams his head against the toilet, causing it to break and have water spill out. While he lies on the floor, the water connects with an electric wire nearby and electrocutes to death the second crony. Rorschach makes his escape. Daniel and Lori then arrive at the prison. The doctor from earlier hides in a room. but then he finds that Rorschach is there with him. Rorschach retrieves his mask and asks the doctor what he sees when it's on him. Meanwhile, Daniel and Lori fight off many prisoners. They rain hell down on them in a prison hallway. When they're done, they spot Rorschach walking in his hero outfit. But before they reunite, Rorschach follows the dwarf into the restroom. He then leaves in a few seconds, and we see blood leaking from the bottom of the closed door. All three of them then get to the roof, and from there enter the airship that awaits them. Police fire away at them while they fly away. When they arrive at their hideout and open the door, Dr. Manhattan is there to meet them. He takes Lori to Mars by teleporting her and himself there. Once there, she starts suffocating, and Dr. Manhattan provides a force field for her so she can breathe. She sees his gigantic creation, which puts her in awe. We then see the original Night Owl at his home. He watches TV and speaks to Lori's mother on the phone. He then gets a knock on the door, and when he says he has to get it, the door gets broken into. Several gangsters come in and beat him for vengeful purposes. He fights with them, but he is old and outnumbered. One of them takes a statuette in his room and beats Night Owl to the floor with it. He is quite possibly dead. Back at Daniel's place, he and Rorschach get into an argument. Afterwards, Rorschach tells Daniel that he is a good friend. They then head off and enter a bar. When they get there, they get some information after confronting some man. Then Daniel sees on the television there that his father was murdered. The reporter saying this mentions the gang that did it, and one of its members happened to be sitting there. Daniel attacks that man and says that he will wipe them all out. Rorschach has to get him away from the man. Dr. Manhattan and Lori walk within the structure that the former created. He tells her how they are all puppets, but he can just see the strings. She then tells him that she is sorry that she went with Daniel, and Dr. Manhattan tells her that she is his only link to humanity. He goes on to show her more of his magnificent structure. In the next scene, we see Nixon turning around in his chair and saying that the nation be taken to DEFCON 1. Meanwhile, Daniel and Rorschach are at Adrian's office. Daniel tries to guess the password on his computer. After missing several times, he gets it eventually when he types Ramses 2. By accessing his computer, Daniel discovers information that Adrian's company has done wrong. We then see a research team standing somewhere with Adrian. They all hold up glasses for a toast. After several seconds, they are all lying on the ground, very likely poisoned. Adrian walks past them in his hero outfit, and behind him follows a very abnormal cat. Back on Mars, Lori tells Dr. Manhattan to stop all of this. He tells her that life is overrated. This prompts her to tell him to make her see things the way he does. He does so, and she gets flooded with past happenings. In the end, she discovers that her real father is Eddie the comedian. With this knowledge, she comes to Dr. Manhattan's structure and strikes it with serious force. It cracks and starts falling apart. As it dangerously falls down in their area, Dr. Manhattan's force field protects Lori from being damaged. When it is all in ruins, he asks her if she will smile if he admits he was wrong. He then admits it, and we see a zoom out take place that reveals them to be standing in a giant smiley face in the sand. After that, Daniel and Rorschach arrive in Antarctica in the airship. We see Adrian watching more than a dozen televisions simultaneously. One of the TVs shows Rorschach and Daniel coming to his fortress. It is uncertain whether Adrian sees that TV or not. They then break into his fortress and sneak to him while he sits in his chair. Rorschach tries to jump at him from behind, but Adrian jumps in time and prevents his attempt. They both then fight Adrian, but he proves to be stronger than them. While Daniel and Rorschach are both down, he tells them that he eliminated Eddie. He tells them everything he did. He even says that he invested $2 billion into Tachyon research so that Dr. Manhattan gets his future vision blocked. He fights them again and proves to be superior. Daniel then tells him that they were supposed to make the world a better place. Adrian tells them that Dr. Manhattan was helping him get his power all this time. Then we see a nuclear bomb go off in New York. It destroys every object and person in its way. One of Nixon's officials tell him that it was not the Russians, but rather Dr. Manhattan. Then we see Dr. Manhattan saying the same thing to Lori, and that it was Adrian that used him. He then teleports to Adrian's fortress. Adrian sees him appear and runs away. Dr. Manhattan goes looking for him. He then stands somewhere that allows Adrian to activate a great amount of electric energy and disintegrate Dr. Manhattan. While he does it, he disintegrates his abnormal cat as well. Adrian then comes back out to Daniel and Rorschach, and then Lori comes in and shoots him. He rolls down the stairs and falls to the floor, but then he gets up. When he does, Dr. Manhattan appears as a giant from outside the fortress and punches through the glass roof. As he shrinks back to normal form and enters the place, he tells Adrian that reconfiguring himself was the first trick he learned. But Adrian then turns on the television, and we see Nixon saying that Dr. Manhattan detonated the bomb in New York. He states that he has become a world enemy. Dr. Manhattan says that they must remain silent about this. But Rorschach disagrees and storms out of the place, intending to inform the people of what actually happened. Outside of the fortress, in the snow, Dr. Manhattan meets him. Rorschach finally takes off his mask and shows them his face. He knows what his friend intends to do to him. Dr. Manhattan says that he can change many things, but he cannot change human nature, and so he destroys Rorschach with his telekinetic power. We see Daniel being devastated by this outcome. Then, alone with Lori, Dr. Manhattan tells her that he is leaving the galaxy. He says goodbye to her and then disappears. After that, Daniel attacks Adrian, but he does not attack back. Daniel tells him that he deformed mankind, that is his legacy. Then he and Lori fly away together in the airship. Time passes, and we see Lori with her mom. She tells her that she knows that Eddie was her father. Then her mom tells her that she was not mad at Eddie because he gave her Lori. Afterwards, Daniel comes in and he and Lori get together. Lori tells him that Dr. Manhattan told her that nothing ever ends. In the final scene, we see two individuals at a newspaper office. The boss tells the employee that they got nothing to write about anymore. The world has turned into a world of peace. The employee tells his boss that he will have something. We then see Rorschach's journal lying in his workspace. As we zoom in on it, Rorschach's voiceover begins from his beginning.